Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to the University of Liverpool WiT Talk, Spring WiT Talk 2022. This is a series of biannual lectures that are offered from the University of Liverpool, the School of Electronic Engineering and Computer Science, and is a series featuring leading women in the field of technology. So my name is Floriana Grasso, and I'm from the Department of Computer Science in the school, and I will be your host today. And it is a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce our speaker today. And we have Dr. Diana Maynard, who joins us from the University of Sheffield. And Diana is a senior research fellow in the Department of Computer Science at Sheffield. Her background is on computational linguistics and then cognitive science, everything in between, and has an extensive research record on information extraction, opinion mining, social media analysis, terminology, semantic web technologies, etc. Numerous work, leading on national international projects, organizing a number of national international events, and then probably the thing she's most known of, I don't know whether I can say that on your behalf, Diana, since 2000, she has been one of the key developers on the phenomenal and widely known project GATE at Sheffield, which is an open source multilingual text analysis tool. She's chair of the GATE training course. She leads the GATE consultancy on information extraction, opinion mining, etc. And so Google GATE if you don't know the work, because it's a really impressive tool. Beside that, I think Diana is one of the polymath here. So her work spans over a wide range of fields: politics, climate change, natural disaster, human rights, geography, journalism. And I think this is where we tie on the talk today. So you will have seen the title, and that's we are looking forward to see what Diana is working on this particular field. So I'll send her live with the slides, and you can post your questions if you like on the Q&A, which you will probably see at the bottom of your screen, either with your name or anonymous if you prefer. That's absolutely fine, and we will read the questions loud at the end of the speech. So the speech will be around half an hour or so, and then we will have time for questions. Okay, without further ado, the floor is yours, Diana. I'll send you live, and we are looking forward to this.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I shall warn you, as you might have guessed from the title of this talk, there's quite a lot of explicit terminology in this talk. So just as a warning, there's a lot of swear words and so on. So I'm going to start with a little clip, little video clip as a way of introduction to what I'm going to be talking about. Hopefully this will work.
Daphne was a household name in Malta. She was almost as well known as the people she wrote about. She'd broken huge stories about the political corruption in Malta. And ultimately, she paid with her life. It was the 16th of October, 2017. Daphne had just left her house in her car. She was a few minutes down the road when a bomb that had been planted underneath the driver's seat exploded. This is a story about murder, and obviously it's a story about a fight for justice by Daphne's family. They were taking on not just a political party and its leader, not just a prime minister, but the institutions of Malta, which they said had failed.
I'll go back to the slide. So, oops, yes, so Daphne Caruana Galizia, this story about Daphne, so she was a journalist in Malta, as you look at it, who helped lead the Panama Papers expose. She was murdered several years ago, and before she was murdered, she also received a lot of online abuse, which then escalated towards real-world abuse. Her dogs were poisoned, and she had a lot of threats and so on. And say, finally, she was murdered. And this story is kind of one of the motivations for a lot of the work that that we're doing now, looking at online abuse against journalists and its escalation, potentially to offline threats, violence, and in some cases even death. So we'll rewind a little bit, but this just sort of sets the scene a little bit for the motivation behind some of the things that we're doing. So to rewind a little, so as Florian already introduced, I work as part of the GATE team in Sheffield. It's a research team of about 15 of us, based in the Natural Language Processing Group in the Computer Science department. And we've been developing tools for analysing language, essentially. The GATE toolkit itself has been developed since 2000, and we've developed applications in a whole range of domains, and you can try out various little demos on the GATE website. So some of the relevant ones to what we're going to be talking about today are applications which look at classifying text to find abuse, particularly on tweets, Twitter stance classification, credibility of sources, and the journalist safety analyzer, which looks at descriptions of violations against journalists. But as I say, we work in many domains. So social media then, as I'm sure you all know, there are a lot of benefits to social media. It lets us keep in touch in a kind of unintrusive way. So instead of necessarily calling someone up on the phone and having a conversation, you can post a status and people can reply, and it's quite a sort of non-proactive, unintrusive way of keeping in touch with people. For example, if I'm going to travel abroad to a conference, I might post on my social media feed that I'm going to be in Paris or Berlin or wherever, and if people want to get in touch and say, oh, let's meet up, they can do it rather than me having to physically call them and say, do you want to meet? So it's quite nice. It lets you make new friends, you can share interests, you can organise events. It's also a great source of sharing critical information. So this might be, for example, people with medical conditions who want to share information and advice. It might be during emergencies, so if something happens, people can provide and receive help. It might be a form of social support, so lots of networking groups and so on, and many uses of social media. This is so we did a project a few years ago looking at using social media for disaster response, and again we developed tools in order to try and map what was going on, to provide tools to help people respond appropriately to requests for help and so on. So we developed tools to help disaster victims get aid quickly. Things like finding mentions of locations in a text. So for example, in a tweet, someone says, the bridge has broken, the river's burst, my house is on fire, whatever it is. You can find mentions of the locations, match them to a knowledge base and plot them on a map. So often the aid workers aren't local to the area, so they don't necessarily know where a particular building or a particular bridge or river or location is. And it might, so this might help disambiguate where they are and what's going on. An example here of a tool, of a message about the news story about the Grenfell Tower, and it plots where the Grenfell Tower is on the map. We can also try and identify things like how important and urgent is the message, what actions need to be taken. So just because you hashtag a particular kind of emergency in a tweet, it might not actually be important at all. So for people who are providing help, it might be just some random chat. It might be completely irrelevant, or it might actually be a very urgent message for help. So we have tools which automatically try and detect what's the event, what's the message about, how important is it, what do we need to do. So that's just one snap example of some useful tools for social media analysis. Problem with social media is that people have a lot of opinions and people love to share opinions on social media. And this is all very well and good when we're in a little social support group and we've got a problem and someone is helping us resolve it, or they're giving us information. It's great, but as I'm sure you all know, people also like to argue a lot on social media, and people don't always keep their opinions to themselves when perhaps they should. So I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing analysing hate speech online towards public figures. This work stems back probably about 10 years or so now. So we started looking at hate speech towards MPs, and we've also started looking at various other kinds of hate speech, including most recently journalists, and in particular female journalists. So yes, more warnings about swear words. So online abuse then, it can put people off debating online. It might actually put people off becoming politicians or journalists. And when they already, when they are a journalist or a politician or someone in the public sphere, it may actually, it may lead to all kinds of problems, mental health problems. It may lead to them even quitting their jobs just because of the nature of the abuse, which can be very, very intimidating, harassing, scary, threatening, not only to them, but even to their families. It can extend to real world violence, and it can have really serious consequences. It seems to be getting worse over the years, and it may be particularly bad for particular groups, so women, ethnic minorities, LGBT, and so on. So examples of comments from some MPs here. My staff try not to let me go out alone. I've received death threats. They were calling for her to be sexually assaulted, killed, and even raped repeatedly to death. My children saw this, and so on. And this in the top right is a tweet towards Maria Ressa, who's a journalist in the Philippines. She received the Nobel Peace Prize last year for her work uncovering corruption in the Philippines, and she's been persecuted. I'm going to go on to talk about this in a little while. So you can see here a horrible doctored image of her. People make parallels. They talk about her being like scrotum face and a monkey. She has eczema on her skin, so they doctor images. It's pretty horrific. So when we do analysis of online abuse, there are a number of things that we're trying to uncover. So we want to know who's being abused, first of all. Who's abusing them? What's the abuse about? What kind of people send abuse? Who are these people sending abuse? Why are they sending it? What are they hoping to achieve? Is it getting worse? How do people respond to it? So how do the victims respond to it? How do bystanders respond to it? And what happens when they do? How does this sort of play out? And then how can we look at preventing and mitigating the abuse online? And how can we prevent it escalating further to more serious forms of abuse? And then also things like, how do abusers avoid detection? So what methods do they employ to try and stop them being detected? And how can we mitigate this? And you can imagine many more questions that come out of this, but this gives you a sort of starting point for the kind of things that we're looking at. So it's quite a multidisciplinary kind of approach to the problem that we take. I mean, our main focus is to develop tools to analyse the abuse and characterise it, so detect, analyse and characterise it. But then we take this further, so as I say, we move into this sort of psychosocial realm as well. So how do we find abuse, first of all? So there are lots of offensive words and phrases that we might see on Twitter or whatever social media platform we're looking at. So we can try and spot these offensive words and phrases. So there's lots of kinds of abuse. And in this talk, I'm taking a very kind of holistic view of abuse to include offensive words, offensive messages, racist, bigoted language, obscene words, threats, and so on, uncivil language. So we can find these kind of horrible words, but that in itself isn't enough. So even if we found a horrible word, and for the sake of this example, we'll use idiot. So just identifying that word isn't precise enough because it might be targeted at different people. So I can say, I'm an idiot, and that's a kind of self-abuse. I'm mocking myself. So we don't really want to worry too much about that. You idiot would be abusive towards the person I'm talking to. We need to know who the person I'm talking to is, of course, but at least we know that it's we're talking about the addressee. What kind of idiot would do that? That's kind of ambiguous because it might be directed at the person we're talking to here as a kind of slightly subtle way of calling them an idiot. It might be referring to yourself. It might be a very kind of generic question. There's all kinds of ways in which we might use a sentence like that. They're idiots, so that's being abusive to other people. And then we might direct our abuse towards a specific person. So Donald Trump is an idiot. So we have to understand the difference between these and interpret them correctly. Hashtags are also often used to signal abuse. So some examples here. Theresa May, if you legalise fox hunting, I will fire an arrow through your face. Kill the witch. And here's one addressed at Rana Ayub, who's another of the journalists that we've been studying. She's a journalist from India. Don't call yourself journalist, you insult the journalist community, you're just a hypocrite, fake news media, and so on. So we see a lot of abusive terms in the hashtags themselves. And we need to sort of be able to untangle these hashtags as well. Now, hashtags often, they smush the words together into one long hashtag, and they also make up like portmanteau words. Separating out the hashtags in itself can be tricky, and we have to be careful. So these are all examples of things which look not very nice, and they're all have perfectly innocent meanings. So the first one we've got Power Gen Italia. Le Bocage is a I think it's a vineyard, if I remember correctly. I can't even think of this one. Mole Station Nursery is a garden centre in Australia. Teachers Talking was a hashtag about kind of support for teachers to get emotional support. Therapist and Experts Exchange, again a group for exchanging advice between experts. So you can see how easily things can be misinterpreted in hashtags. So that's one small challenge, is that we have to be able to interpret these things correctly. So our methodology then for analysing abuse in general. So over the years we've sort of developed a methodology whereby we have tools which enable us to collect, to make a collection of data. So we collect, for example, all tweets to, from, and about our target, so the person we're interested in studying or the group of people we're interested in studying. So it might be a range of politicians, like all British MPs. It might be a specific set of journalists, footballers, whatever. So we collect, for example, all tweets by that person or that group of people, all replies to them, anyone who mentions them or mentions them by name, and any retweets of all these things. So we have a big collection of tweets. And And then we annotate all the interesting information. So we use our gate tools and additional classifiers to try and figure out who are the people, what's happening, when is it happening, where is it happening, first of all. So that's the kind of generic social media toolkit. So for example, with politicians, it might recognize the name of the politician, it might link it to an external database which tells you more about that politician, such as which constituency they're from, what party they support, how old they are, and so on. And then we run abuse classifiers, which try to detect, is there abuse in this message? Is it targeted at the person that we're interested in? What kind of abuse is it? So we categorize the abuse into, you know, whether it's sexist, whether it contains sexual terms, whether it's racist, and so on and so forth. And we might also categorize things like, you know, how strong is the abuse? How sure are we that it is abusive, and so on. Then we index all the information using an elastic index. And then we apply sophisticated search techniques in order to analyze the information. So we could do complex queries. So for example, we could look at all MPs over a certain age in the north of the country who are male or whatever. And then we can look at specifically, you know, the kinds of abuse, the dates, the times, whatever. And then to help us understand all this, our most recent work in the last few months has been building a dashboard which lets us visualize all the results of the queries. So now we can produce nice graphs, we can dig into the data, we can click on an interesting looking hashtag or an interesting abuse term, and then we can find out when it was used, who replied to it, and all kinds of statistics around it. And the same for particular people, so we can look at who's sending the abuse, what are their networks, you know, when do they send abuse, what kind of abuse do they send, what happens to them, what does their Twitter profile look like, and so on and so forth. So just some examples of the data analysis that we've been doing. So for the MPs, here's just a heat map which shows the darker the colour, the more evidence we find of these words. So we can see particular terms linked with abuse against particular MPs. This was a few years ago when Theresa May was in power. So the darker ones, as I say, we see more evidence. So kill, for example, is most strongly associated with Jeremy Corbyn at that time, and so on. And what we find in particular is that abuse differs in style when directed at men and women. So we see it very differently. And again, this links with social science research that the way to attack a woman in general, I mean, this is very broad, but in general, women will be most upset and feel most threatened when you use sexual terminology. For men, it's more about power, so indicating they're not very good at their job. However, as we'll come on to see with the journalists, we do see a lot of abuse against female journalists, which is attacking their reputation, their professional credibility. But we do also see a lot of sexual terminology, more so than with men. So we can compare the use of abusive words towards men and women. Again, this is with the MPs. So we can see some words are used more for women than men. And it's not always related to you know, sexual body parts and so on. Sometimes it is, but not always. So when we look at the hate speech towards the UK politicians, we compared 2015 and 2017. We can see that the abuse increased in 2017. So overall, there was more abuse. We actually found that men got more abuse than women, and Conservatives got more than Labour. However, this is very much linked to the events that were taking place at the time, the roles of the MPs at that particular moment, and so on. This is all proportional, by the way. So this is as a proportion of the replies they received. So, for example, 9.3% of the replies received by Boris Johnson were abusive. So the way to interpret these sunbursts is the inner layer is coloured by the political party. And then, so for example, so of this blue Conservative ring here, it's split into blue for men and pink for women. So we see the proportion of men and women. And then this outer circle is individual MPs. And it's interactive, so you can click on it and get all the information. There are a lot of problems with these kind of abuse analysis. So we see a lot of under the radar abuse. We see things which aren't explicit, they're very implicit. Things like manipulated images in particular. So on the right, we've got an example of a manipulated image from Maria Ressa, calling her the queen of fake news. We see subtle kind of gaslighting effect. When we were studying Carol Cadwallader, a British journalist, we saw this very strongly. So this is targeted at her credibility and her reputation. And the effect of an individual tweet, which might be calling her an idiot, or they called her Carol Codswallop a lot, and various other things, Mad Cat Lady and so on. So the effect of a single tweet might not be that serious on its own. It's very different from talking about coming to rape your unborn children and so on, which we also seen in the data. But the effect over time builds up in this kind of gaslighting approach. We have contextual references, which you might only understand that it's being abusive if you understand the context behind it. And we also have, we struggle a lot of the time with correctly identifying who the abuse is actually targeted to. So there's an example here. We see various app mentions, and we say, "Dear Aaron Banks, I'm also sorry," etc., etc. So we have to be able to interpret who actually are they referring to when they're using this abusive terminology. Sometimes it's hard, even for a person, let alone for a machine, to be able to detect these. So our approach is basically that we only detect abuse when we're fairly sure about it, so we know that our tools miss a lot. So a couple of case studies then. This is Maria Ressa, who I mentioned before. Again, some examples of terms they've used against her. So using NLP, we analysed about 500,000 Facebook and Twitter posts. We found that about 60% of the attacks were designed to undermine her professional credibility, and they frequently used disinformation tactics. Over 40% of them were personal, and we saw lots of evidence of coordinated and orchestrated attacks. This is because she was writing a lot about the corruption in the government and so on. And we see offline consequences. So we really see that the social media platforms are the enabling environment for her persecution, her prosecution, and her conviction. So she's still potentially facing the rest of her life in jail on trumped up charges. So again, here's some visualization. So we can see things like a word cloud of the typical terms used against her. Here on the right, we see the categorization broken down into different types, so attacks on her credibility, political abuse, personal attacks, and so on. And at the top, we've got a timeline. So these are the spikes in abuse that we see, and we correlate them with events that are happening in the real world. So the libel verdict, an interview with ABC Australia, and so on. And here we have some so clustering of comments. This is actually from her Facebook page. And so what's happening here is that the tweets are clustered into different types. So we see a whole set of attacks on her credibility. We see attacks from specific kinds of people. So attacks that things relating to the drug war, things relating to Dilawan, and so on. So again, we see these very clear indications of orchestrated attacks. On occasion, this has led Facebook to actually remove accounts identified as participating in this coordinated behaviour. But a lot of the social media platforms in general, so much abuse that they just don't remove for whatever reason. We see hashtags designed to encourage swarms of attackers and fueling patriotic trolling, sometimes even with threats in them, like the hashtag arrest Maria Ressa. We see memes and manipulated images deployed specifically to increase engagement with the attacks, and also to try and avoid automated detection, because it's very hard to actually to automatically understand these manipulated images, and doxing as well, publishing private or personal information. Oops. So disinformation then, journalists often get accused of lying or being a bad journalist in order to discredit them. And those specifically who report on disinformation get a lot of abuse themselves. So again, kind of terms that we see frequently. And Mariana Springs, we also studied her, is a very good example of someone who reports on disinformation. She's the BBC specialist disinformation reporter, and she herself gets a lot of abuse precisely for this reason. Again, some examples there. Oops. So most recently, we've been working on a project funded by the UK Foreign Office to try and develop an early warning system to try and help detect, predict, and ultimately prevent violence against women journalists. We're just coming to the end of the project now, or at least the first phase of it. So we've been looking at various female journalists around the world, one of which is Rana Ayub, who I mentioned before, from India. So we've analysed 13 million tweets sent over the last 2 years connected with her. And we see over 44,000 blatantly abusive tweets. Again, you see some pictures of the kinds of abuse she gets, the words used, and the breakdown into categories. And again, some examples. So a couple of striking things. We see that over 40% of her tweets had at least one abusive reply. And this is a timeline here where we see a massive spike of retweets on May the 20th. The other striking thing, particularly in Rana's case, is that these abusive replies happen almost instantly. So some occur within 2 seconds of tweeting. And I've seen this myself when I've tweeted something about Rana. Within 2 seconds, someone's replied abusively. The majority of all the abusive replies occur within 3 minutes. So this graph shows the number of minutes until the first abusive reply. So we see that nearly 300 of these tweets had an abusive reply, the first one within 3 minutes. So these are all kind of strong indicators of coordinated attacks. And we can look at the co-reply network. So this is the people sending the abuse, how they connected to each other. We've just anonymized the names a little bit here, but this graph on the right shows the connections between people sending abuse. So the lines between them show that they replied to the same tweet, and the nodes, the bigger the node, the more tweets they sent. So the ones with the biggest blobs sent more abuse, yes, they're coloured. So they're coloured in terms of communities, if you like. So the community detection algorithm has detected that these form in some way a group of related people. And then here in the main bit of the window, we see this person. So he'd abusively replied to 87 tweets. And again, we can look at the connections between them. So we can see that these two people co-replied. So they both replied abusively to the same 5 tweets of the target. So we can start to look at connections and try and understand coordinated behaviour and so on. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all the stuff we've been doing. Some challenges ahead. So fairness in machine learning models. This is particularly relevant to abuse detection. So when we use automated classification techniques, they're often quite biased towards training data and towards particular types and groups. How we can detect the real subtleties of speech. There are many cases of abuse that we don't recognise automatically because they're very hard to understand, even for a person. How can we maintain the balance with freedom of speech and online safety and integrity? So how far can you go in voicing your opinion before it becomes abusive, and how can we allow people to express their opinions, especially politically, while still maintaining online safety? How can we work with social media platforms to try and ensure best practices? There's a lot of ethical issues as well around the use of personal information when we come to doing research. So we have to be careful about things like predicting individual characteristics of people. So we can't sort of go around saying we've analysed these tweets and, you know, this is the kind of person that, you know, is most likely to send abuse, and we have to be very, very careful about, you know, what we do that. And finally, we have to ensure our own mental and physical safety. So, you know, when I've been working with, especially with Rana Ayub, and I've been posting messages, even just, you know, talking about the kinds of work we're doing, I've had, you know, horrible abusive messages myself from her attackers. And it can get quite worrying, and, you know, physically these things can escalate to physical safety, plus for the journalists themselves, of course. So what more can be done then? So these methods of attack are growing more and more sophisticated, and they're evolving with technology. They're increasingly networked and fueled by political actors. So there's a need for responses to online violence to grow equally in technological and sophistication and collaborative coordination in order to match the sophistication of these threats. Most women journalists don't report or make public the online attacks they experience for a number of reasons. And this is partly because people are still reluctant to take online violence seriously. So there's a need also for employers to support them, for the community to support them, for the media platforms to take responsibility. The internet communications companies themselves, their services facilitate much of the abuse, and this is a really tricky one in trying to find a good balance between how they can take effective action without going overboard. And it's very easy to say, well, you know, they should, you know, throw people off Twitter, they should remove the messages and so on. But already it's quite easy to overgenerate this stuff. So ironically, someone was asking about a project I was working on connected with this. And jokingly on Facebook, I said, oh, I can't tell you anymore, or I'd have to kill you. And my message got banned from Facebook, and I got a warning that if I did it again, I'd get removed from Facebook. And the irony was, I was actually talking about the fact that the thing I couldn't talk about was the fact that we were working, you know, with the internet companies to try and you know, to work on exactly the problem that they were overgenerating on removing abuse. So you know, clearly I wasn't, you know, I wasn't abusing anyone or going to kill them, but, you know, it's very easy to go overboard. So it's a very fine line between being able to detect and deal with abuse correctly by automated tools, and, you know, not doing enough. And we're still in the process of finding the, you know, the good balance there. So a few links to more information. There's, oh, I went a bit fast. Yes, the work on the journalist study is going to be finished very soon. There's two studies of previous work we've been doing against the online abuse against journalists, and the full report for that for UNESCO is coming out. It's supposed to be published, in fact, next week as part of World Press Freedom Day. So there we go, whistle stop tour. Hopefully I've left enough time for questions. Okay.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you very much, Diana. That was very, very, very interesting. So I guess I'll start off with a question while we wait for the Q&A to pile up.
Stop sharing. I'm not sure.
If you please, that's fine. So the question is, I guess your data finishes a while ago before you started with your investigation. I wonder how current it is now, and whether it is true from your experience, as everybody seems to believe that the lockdown in COVID has exacerbated online violence or online kind of bad behavior, or whether it's just a kind of a myth, as many others.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, the data collections we've been doing, I mean, we're still collecting data for a lot of these things now. So the work with the journalists that I've just been talking about, that collection finished actually the 1st of March, so it's pretty recent. Some of it is a lot older, but yeah. So some of the data, and we're constantly collecting data for various sources. In terms of whether the abuse has got worse, I think that there have been studies definitely that show that for certain things, abuse did definitely escalate during lockdown. I mean, this is linked with disinformation as well. So there's, I mean, and it's all, there's never just one reason for these things. So COVID itself has introduced firstly a lot of disinformation, but also, a lot of abuse based around that. There's certainly a lot of, there's evidence that when we look at what kinds of people send abuse and why are they sending it, that's a very complicated scenario. So when we're looking at these cases of abuse against journalists, a lot of this is linked with political situations, and it's linked with the kinds of things that the journalists are tweeting about and writing about in their stories, right? So that kind of abuse hasn't particularly escalated as a result of lockdown and the COVID, because most of that, what we've been studying there, is linked more with the contextual situations, right? And it's less sort of angry, bored people sitting at home, frustrated with their situation. Having said that, there's clearly there was a lot of abuse towards politicians during COVID because of what they thought the politicians were or were not doing and the situation. So there was a lot of abuse around the whole COVID situation. So the nature of the abuse, changed in that respect. When we looked at the abuse against politicians a few years ago, and we looked at kind of who was sending the abuse, it was interesting. We found two kind of groups of people. So one group of people were very much, they had a very specific politician that they didn't like, and they fired lots and lots of abuse at that person. So pretty much anything they said, they got abuse from these people, right? It may extend to the group, so the Conservative Party or just Boris Johnson or whoever. So anything they say, they fire abuse at, and that's often what we see with the journalists as well. There's another group of people who are just generally angry people, and they just fire off abuse at anyone and everyone, kind of almost indiscriminately. I call it the scattergun approach. It's just they're clearly more. A lot of them may have. They may have anger issues, or they may have their own problems, and they're just sat at home being angry generally, and the kind of thing which in the pub, they're the people who are always getting into arguments. So I think those kind of people in particular, you see a lot more of that when people are unhappy. They rant on Twitter. So you see a lot more of that kind of abuse, people getting abusive at people on, I don't know, Britain's Got Talent or whatever it is, whatever, stupid programs, EastEnders, you see a lot more of that kind of abuse when people are, generally unhappy and bored and sat at home. So I think from that
actually,
side,
we have one of the questions that can be tied to what you're saying right
Sorry,
now.
yeah.
The question is, are the majority of online abuse coming from faceless accounts?
So that's an interesting question. A lot of it is, so it depends. So when the abuse is linked with these kind of coordinated accounts, we often see these kind of, faceless accounts. We do also see abuse where people are not shy to say who they are, which is interesting. So we see both types. We also see people who get kicked out of Twitter for being abusive, and then they come back with a new, with more accounts. And sometimes they don't hide that. I've seen, in their profiles, they sometimes say, I've been removed from Twitter and I'm back. New account. I mean, it's incredible. And they post this in their, their tweets. So you do see, or you see people coming back with, you know, an almost identical name for the account, but with a different or whatever. So there's a mixture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question from the chat: are social media companies carrying out work like this on a large scale to source out abuse, or is what they're doing never going to be enough?
To be honest, it's probably never going to be enough, because it's impossible to automate everything, right? It's impossible because technology will never be that good, and you can't, at least not without massively over generating everything. So you can't do it all automatically. There are so many problems with trying to do it, and I mean the social media platforms mostly have a mixture of automated tools and people, who are either reviewing it or in some cases, looking at things from scratch. And while the social media companies definitely could do a lot more, it is very hard for them to actually to deal with everything. And this is particularly true for different languages. I didn't mention that we've been working, our current work, we've been working in several different languages. We've been looking at Arabic, we've been looking at Hindi and so on, Spanish. We've been looking at Mexican Spanish, which has very specific kinds of insults. So you need native speakers a lot of the time to understand the situation, to understand the ambiguity, and just because there aren't tools for every language, and even the ones that are available for various languages may not be as good as they are for English. So it's particularly problematic for non-English languages, and especially non-European languages and more minority languages. So yeah, there are a lot of people out there supplementing the automated tools from the social media companies, but it's never going to be enough. And often they also they rely on people to report things, and then they can't, and not everything gets reported. There are a lot of issues. We've developed a set of recommendations, in fact, for what we think that the social media companies, among other things, should be trying to do, and we've been trying to work with them to suggest in positive ways
Sure.
how they could do more.
We have a question from Valentina. Says, hello Diana, thanks very much for a fascinating talk. I found particularly interesting the part where you were talking about detecting, coordinating attacks. Is there a way to identify members of these networks and understand better what is their motivation and how can they be stopped?
Yes, so that's quite a complex task, and again, we have to be careful about what we say and do here. But there are various pieces of evidence which may suggest coordinated attacks. So things like the time it takes for abuse to appear. So these very short time periods suggest some bot-like behavior when you see abuse within like a second of something being posted. When you see these networks, so these the tools we've just literally these co-reply graph that I showed, the network, those tools actually we've literally just been developing in the last few months. So in fact we're still working on them now. So these kind of network analysis tools help you see connections between different people who send the abuse. So that tool's really nice because it lets us explore the correlations between them. We can also look at the what they're actually tweeting. So sometimes we'll just see very, very similar or exactly the same tweets, but originating from different users or allegedly different users. We look at the retweets as well, and we see that. So there's a whole bunch of techniques we can use to try and suggest coordinated behavior. But it's yeah, I mean, also we see these kind of coordinated behavior a lot linked again with political situations. So we see it very clearly in the case of people like Maria Ressa, because it's most of the abuse is all about trying to discredit her. It's because it's pro-government, pro-Duterte support, trying to and we see people actually, inciting people to join them in the abuse, with seeding these hashtags like arrest Maria and, Maria's alive, whatever. So it's very clear that, these are coordinated, but I think, the same with all the abuse detection and characterization and analysis tools that we're developing is, in my opinion, it's about sort of there's no one single solution to anything, right? It's about developing a sort of arsenal of tools. And it's the same with looking at this escalation between online and offline violence. It's about developing this a whole collection of different tools which let you dig into the data and try and understand the picture of what's going on. And again, similarly with looking at what's being tweeted, who's sending it, when are they sending it, how does it get disseminated? All these things, they're all little jigsaw pieces that fit together to build up a picture of what's going on.
Kind of related to this, there's a question from Brett in the audience, and he asks, do you find the type of abuse differs from the gender of the abuser? So you mentioned that it's different for the abusee, but...
So that's a very good question, and it's something we've not actually looked into yet, but it's something that's been on our list to look at for a while. So, we've done a little bit of analysis. So we saw, I think it was when we were looking at Carol Cadwallader, the British journalist, and we did see quite a few. We even saw, sexually kind of themed abuse from women as well as men. But a lot of the abuse against the women journalists that we're looking at is gendered, and it's from men. But we haven't looked much into that. One thing that that's kind of related to that is this kind of notion of in-group and out-group abuse. So, for example, if you have, racist abuse or homophobic abuse, sometimes it's actually from within the community itself, as opposed to with that outside the community. And we can apply this to gendered abuse and whether the abuse comes from women or not. So we haven't dug into this in any detail. And in fact, I don't know many people that have. I think it's still an area which is quite underexplored.
Brilliant. Last question, and then we can wrap up the session because we are close to the hour at this point. So again, from the audience, I personally believe handling fake information in news is equally important as handling hateful comments. Identifying the fake news would certainly help in preventing the problem to some extent that leads to hateful comments. Have you had any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I was going to include some slides about this, but then I sort of had so much information. I thought I'd focus more on this. I alluded to disinformation a little bit. We have we've had a whole series of projects looking at disinformation, and in particular the European We Verify project, which is designed exactly to try and unpick, categorize, detect and unpick the whole disinformation scenarios, particularly with relation to journalism. So we've done quite a lot of work on disinformation, and it's interesting because yes, the two fields do actually collide quite a lot, and we've been finding this more and more that that disinformation is a major part of it. And it's, we see it also with COVID now, so we've been doing a lot of work on COVID disinformation, and trying to unpick, what's going on there. But one of the, as I said, I think in the talk, one of the typical ways in which the abuse is seeded is by actually using disinformation and to try and discredit the journalists themselves. But these things are strongly connected. So I agree, definitely. More a lot more work can be done in this area. Yes, and this idea of the manipulated images and videos, memes. So that falls into both categories as well. So we've been working on looking at how to identify when when images and memes and so on have been doctored, when they're and if we can bring this also into the abuse detection, this would be really helpful, because at the moment all we're looking at is the text, but we're not looking at, for example, people just even screenshots of other abuse and so on, and some of the horrible images. So if we can detect the abuse within those as well, we can feed this into our tools. But we're not quite there yet with that. Still very much work in progress. many avenues still to explore.
Yeah, well, and on this note, and hoping for many more years to come on research on this, I think we can close this interesting afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on this talk. And again, a massive thanks to Diana for joining us today and for this interesting talk. And I'll close the session. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll see you all for the next WiT talk in the autumn. Thanks, Diana, again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.